Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. You're watching our cloud school where we are discussing various data integration scenarios with the help of Azure Data Factory. Today in this video, we will discuss a scenario where we have an XML file which contains multiple records and we want to insert or update those records into a SQL Server table. So let's take an example of this JSON which is here on my screen. It contains the record of the different books. So let's say this is a library collection XML. It contains the information about the various different books. It has a book ID, then author, title, genre, then price, published date, and so on. So what we want to do is we would like to insert a record of all these. What we want to do is we want to insert all these book records into a SQL Server table from this XML using Azure Data Factory. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the Data Factory pipeline. So let me just click on these three dots and I'll be creating this new pipeline. So that will open the canvas board. As we are dealing with a complex XML which contains the collection of nodes or the different items. So to insert or to copy the data from this XML which is there on the blob storage to the SQL Server, I'm going to use the move and transform activity, and this time I'm going to use the data flow. So what is data flow? That is something we have discussed in our previous example. Now in this case we are going to use the data flow with the help of XML. So as we know that the data flow requires the settings as in data flow to be provided, which means that we have to create a new data flow. Right now we do not have any data flow for this action. So what is data flow? Data flow is the workflow which you define for your data. For an example, a workflow can contain selection of few tables or records from various tables, then performing the join or aggregation operations on those different columns or the tables, and then pre-populating those data and sending it to the destination or the sync table. So all those activities which you would like to perform on your data, that you can perform or define your workflow with the help of data flow. To create a data flow, you can click here on these three dots and you can create the data flow. So let me just click on these three dots and create new data flow. So first of all, the very first thing your data flow requires is it requires a source. So from where your data is expected to come, you can have one or more source, but at least one source you have to define. So let me click add new source, and by clicking on this button, this is what the properties section we will add. Like I mentioned, a data flow can have multiple data sources, as you can have multiple sources from where your data is expected to arrive. Now each source would require the data set to be provided. So in our case, we have a data source which is of type Azure storage account. So we have to create a data source which is of Azure storage account, and the file format I'm going to use XML in this case so that it reads the XML data. So let me call it as an DS blob XML so that we know that it is dealing with an XML. I'm going to use the link service which is associated with that the storage account, and using the link service we should be able to browse all the containers of that storage account. As we can see that we have these containers, input container, which we are able to browse it. Now from these container we are looking for this book.xml which contains the data related to the books which we want to deal with it. So with that, our data set is ready. If I click on OK, that will be set here on this particular section as in the source option. So let me call it as in source as the book XML. That is what the source we want to give it. So let me just remove the spaces because it does not expect the space to be provided. So my source is ready. There are source options available which you may want to provide, but in our case I'm not going to use any of the source option. Next you have the projection, so you can import the XML projection, which will import the XML schema basically depending upon the XML which you are using, and that by having that schema you would be able to identify how your XML schema and different attribute of the XML looks like. So as you can see that I have the XML schema which contains the catalog as in column, and after that we have the books, and then within the book we have various attributes like ID, author, description, and then price, right? Next, if you would like to perform any kind of a partition, you may want to specify the partition information. In this case, we don't want to specify any kind of a partition. We want to have a look at the attribute of the attribute type. Then you can go to the inspection of tab. That is where we will find the details about the different attributes and its type. Here we can have a data preview option that will preview the data, as it is dealing with a complex object which contains the catalog. So we would have a catalog, then it would have the books, and then possibly it may or may not display the entire attribute, because books is of type array, so it displays the object type and then attributes of the object. So right now catalog is an object, then it has an attribute which is of book type, but book itself is a type of array, hence it is not expanding. So any array type, this data preview option is not going to expand. Now what we need to do is, we would like this array, which is this array, into a flat structure, and for that reason we are going to use a new action or new activity after this source. So I'm going to click on this tiny plus button, and here you would find all those different type of activities which you can perform on the source. So for this exercise I would like to flatten my attributes in the flat structure. So I'm going to use the format option as in flatten, and as soon as you select this flatten option, let's say flat XML attribute, so that is what the name I have given. It has automatically selected the incoming stream from the previous source type, and now you have to specify on what basis you would like to unroll or flat your XML content. So here you can see that it will give an option to select if your object is, or your XML or JSON contains any array element, because array is an element, array type element is something which you can specify in the flatten. If your XML or JSON does not contain any array element, then it's not, then this flattening transformation will not work. So as we are dealing with an array of book, so I'm going to select this book as an element. So now you have to specify the column by column or attribute to attribute which you would like to use. Let me just call it as in book ID, right? Next I'm going to add another column, and then likewise I will add all my columns: author, description, so it has automatically detected all the different column names based on the child attribute name. But if you would like to change the name differently, for example if you want to make it uppercase or lowercase, things like that, then you have full option to do that. You can do that anytime. So these are our columns basically which we have, which we would like to insert into our book table. So let's go to the data preview option now. How does it looks like? Optimization we don't want. Inspection, you can see that now as inspection we have got two options: input, from which shows the XML data structure, how does it the XML hierarchy looks like, and then output is the after the flatten action will be performed, what would be the your data type or data structure will look like along with the types. Next you can click on this refresh option to preview your data. Of course, to preview any data within the data flow you have to have this debug option enabled, which I have already debugged for an hour for this demonstration. But in case if you are not able to have a preview, then you may require to click on this enable debug to preview. Now you can see that all my books along with book ID and the other columns are displayed in the flat structure, which means that I'm good to basically insert this record into a table. Now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a sink, which is a destination type. In our case, the sink is the SQL server right now. So I'll be choosing this, and we have to define the data set which is of type SQL server. As of now, I have a data set which is of SQL server, but it is pointing to a specific table. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a data type which is generic data type, and that we will use, which can work on any dynamic table. So let me just click on this add new, and I'll use the SQL server as in data table. I already have a link service which we can use, so let me just call it as a DS SQL generic. Here you can specify the name of the table. So as of now in our SQL server we just have one table. Let me just show you. So this is my table. Let me just refresh it. This is the only table I have it right now. As we want new table to be created dynamically, so what I'm going to do is click OK. I'm not going to specify any table name. After clicking on this, the new data set has been created. If you expand this data set, you would see that this data set is created. This is showing as in checkout. But here in this data set, the table name is not selected, which means that if I'm going to validate my data flow, it will give an error that the table name is not selected. So please select the table name. Now, how do we provide the table name? There are two options. Either you select it. So if you already have the table created in the SQL server, but if you dynamically want to create a table which is not present right now, you can dynamically create by clicking on this edit option. Specify the schema. Of course, the user which we are using in the link service to connect to the SQL server should have the appropriate permission to create the table or to modify the schema. Then only this actions will work. But in my case, my user which is used inside this link service is having the admin access, so it will create or it will perform the operations like creating the table. Here you can specify the table name. Either you can specify the table name as a hard-coded table name, what we have seen in our previous demonstration, or we can make use of the parameters. So in this demonstration, I would like to make use of parameters. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new parameter. So I'll click on this parameters section, click add new, and that will add a new parameter. So let me just close this. So give it a name to the parameter table name. That is the name you want to give. And default value, I don't want to give any default value, but in your case, if you would like to give a default value to your table name, that is also fine. So let's go back to the connections. Here we have to specify the table name. I'll click on this dynamic content, and as soon as you click on this dynamic content, you get an query explorer or query window wherein you can write your dynamic query, which will generate a result or output which can be used in this connection information. So as of now, I would like to use the table as a parameter, right, which I want to use it as a table name. So whatever is the parameter name in the table name parameter will be there. That is something which I want to use as my table name. If you would like to perform or auto generate the table name based on different functions or some logical operation, that you can perform it by writing the dynamic query content using these functions. That is something we are not going to do. So for now, just define the parameter is enough. As soon as I click on this table name, it gives the query expression for using the parameters in this data set. It says that at the dataset.table name, which is the parameter it is going to use. So now you can see that using this data set, my table name is going to be dbo.the table name, which is going to be provided in this parameter. Now the parameter needs to be provided by the sink or whoever is using this data set. That resource needs to provide the table name, but here in this case you do not have any option to provide the parameter which is of table name here in the data set. I was expecting this parameter to be available here, because when we deal the same thing, not in the workflow, not in the data flow, but if we would have done the similar configuration in the pipeline directly, then there would have been an option to specify the table name directly in the pipeline, but not here in the data flow. So let me give it a name to my sink. I'm going to call it as in books. So that's the books we are going to finally write. Just to revise, we are reading an XML, we are converting the XML object into a flat structure using this flat attribute, transformation attribute, and then afterwards we are generating a new book table which would have all the flat structure, right? Now what we want to do is we want to go back to our pipeline where we have dragged or added our data flow activity, but we have not selected the data flow. So here I'm going to select the data flow which we have created just now. So I'm going to select it. As soon as I've selected the data flow, it has recognized the different parameters which are being used in the different activities or different transformation activities within the data flow, and it has listed down all those different parameters. So this parameter is part of the books parameter, which is books is the transformation activity, which is sync activity. So that is why it is given as in book, and then name of the parameter, which is table name. So I'm going to call it as in books, which is the name of my table. Now that is the only parameter it is expecting. Let me just validate my pipeline. So pipeline validation is completed, which means that I should be able to run this pipeline after publish or even in debug mode. So let me just run this pipeline in debug mode. I'm expecting this to read from XML and then insert into a book table or table which it will create new right from the beginning. So I've clicked on the debug mode. That will open the pipeline instance which it is running in an output section, and it might take a couple of seconds to basically create the book table and insert all those records in the book table from XML. So let's wait for this to be completed. So our pipeline is successfully completed. We can click on this lens icon that will give the detailed view of all those activities which are being performed inside the data flow, and we can see that okay, from this option we have got it has taken this much of time, and then it has calculated 12 rows in the flat structure, and afterwards in the SQL server again it has basically inserted those 12 rows. Now to verify the activities, what I'm going to do is I'm going to refresh my Azure Data Explorer, Data Studio. Let me refresh that. As we can see that we have a new table which is a book table, and it has got all those columns which were there inside the XML. Now let me just run the query just to make sure that it has got the records as well. So as expected, we have got 12 books record which were there in the XML, and we have uploaded or inserted those records from XML to the SQL server. Now in this approach we have used a way of creating the table dynamically, but in most of your cases it might possible that your table is already created by your DBOs and it would have certain restriction. For an example, when we dynamically create the table, it has not generated any primary key on the book ID, but it might possible you may have a SQL server in which you would like to have a primary key column auto generated, or maybe a column which would have been which would have received the value from the input itself, but it should be a unique value. Now as this does not contains a unique value, what is going to happen is, now if I rerun the pipeline multiple times, it would allow duplicate book records to be inserted into this table multiple times. So that is something you may want to prevent it, right? If that is the thing you want to do is, so first level of restriction you can apply is right here in this table, or the second level of restriction you can apply into your sync data activity. So let me go back to the data flow sync. Here in the settings we are using allow insert. So instead of that we should have used the allow upsert, and based on a column or set of column we should be identifying or making a decision that based on, let's say, book ID, a unique record should be identified. If there is a duplicate book ID we are trying to insert from data flow or data factory, then it should basically reject those records. So that is what we are that is what we can do. But this, as I mentioned, this is just demonstration, just to give you a capability of using the data flow activity to perform the insertion of multiple record from XML to the SQL server. And that's what we have achieved, right? So I hope you have learned something here in this video. Just to summarize, we have inserted a record from XML to SQL server, and we have used the parameters as well. I hope you have found this useful. If it is, please give it a thumbs up and do not forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks for watching it. See you in the next video.